Like when I was watching some of the debates that you've engaged in, it almost seems like they're politicians. It almost seems like they're wetting their finger and going with the breeze. There's some conversations that you had that were just, I had to stop and rewind them because I couldn't believe the arguments. There was a woman, I don't know, it was was it a transgender man that you were having a discussion with that was saying that there's no difference, no biological difference in the sexes?
Yeah, no biological difference. He said that the scientific consensus for the last 4... I'm not sure. I don't believe so. He was a professor who taught transgender studies at the University of Toronto. And he said outright that there were no biological differences between men and women and that was the scientific consensus. And he believed that he had the qualifications to say that because he was a historian of medicine, which hardly qualifies as a scientist. Not that you have to be a scientist to notice that there are biological differences between men and women. It was very bizarre for me at that point in the last few months because I was under substantial pressure from the university to stop repeating my claim that I wouldn't use compelled pronouns to refer to people, because the university regarded that as against the university policies and also against the Ontario Human Rights Code, so also illegal. And as my employers, they're responsible for everything I say, whether or not there has been a complaint made, whether or not the consequence of my speech is intended or unintended, because that's built into the legislation. And believe me, that's coming your way, because this legislation spreads like mad. But on the one hand, I got 2 letters of warning from the university for refusing to use these compelled pronouns, which I regard as the ideological constructions of radical left-wingers. And this professor went on the agenda, this Ontario news show, and announced publicly that there were no biological differences between men and women. It was like, you'd think maybe the university would have had something to say about that, since they do, in fact, have a biology department. But, oh no, that went by without notice. That's was perfectly fine. It's insane.
It's such an insane thing to say. If there's no biological difference, then why are they taking hormones?
Well, that's a good question. Why bother with the surgery and especially the hormones?
Yeah.
Because that's not, like, you could argue with surgery that's cosmetic, right?
Yeah. This person, whoever this professor was, is expert in transgender studies.
Nicholas Matt.
I'm pretty sure that used to be a woman, or she, they. You're not allowed to say that. If you say that, you're a bad person. If you say they. And they and them is the most reasonable of these these alternative pronouns, they and them. Like you could say, if you know a guy and he doesn't know how to swim, they should probably stay out of the pool.
Right. Well,
you could say that. You could use that in a non-plural form.
Yes, and they is used to repair awkward sentences, basically. Yes. But it's never been used, despite the claims of the gender bender activists. It's never been used for the singular, and we shouldn't give up the distinction.
Language.
We shouldn't give up the distinction between the plural and the singular.
No, it's ridiculous.
Actually need to know whether it's one person or more than one person.
Do you think it's reasonable for people that are asexual, people that really are uncomfortable with the idea of being a man or a woman, is it reasonable that we come up with a distinction for that? I mean, that seems like it would be nice, and this is one of the things that you've said. One of the things that you don't like about this is that you're being compelled to use these made-up pronouns, and that if we as a society, as a culture, as a civilization sort of adopt a new phrase, that you would be fine with that.
Well, we kind of had one. We had transsexual.
Yeah, but...
I know.
That's problematic because it's not asexual. Transsexual would be transition. And here's the other distinction. This is another important thing. Those aren't the people that have the problem with it. The people that have the problem with these pronouns, the transsexual community almost entirely, or at least, I shouldn't say entirely, but predominantly prefer the alternative pronoun.
Yeah, right.
A male to female transgender person prefers to be called a woman or she and use the female pronouns.
It's
male,
the whole point.
Yes.
So there's some tiny fraction of the transsexual community, or we could say there's some tiny fraction of people who are identifying themselves with the transgender community, which is already a tiny fraction, who claims that they have an identity that doesn't fit into either binary category.
Right.
Well, it's a proposition that I think bears some scrutiny to begin with, because I don't believe that the claims that tiny community is making are coherent in any sense, because they say, well, you could be man, woman, or neither, or both. Those aren't coherent claims in my estimation. And if what they're saying is we don't fit into a category, and therefore we get to invent our own plurality of categories. It's not logically tenable. That isn't how it works, because you get an infinite number of categories out of that. And that's what's happening already online.
One of my favorite stories came out of an all-girls university in Massachusetts, where a group of women, where they were trying to pick a president of the student body or whatever, and one of the girls who went to that school decided that she identified as a man, so she changed her name. And I don't believe there was any hormones or anything involved. I think she just changed her name. She called herself masculine of center, genderqueer, changed her name to a masculine name, ran for president of whatever the hell this is.
I think it was Wellesley.
Yes, I believe you're right. Won, and then was denounced by the rest of the class because now she was a white male, so she was a part of the patriarchy, and she was a part of the whole problem with society, and that she should not be allowed, or he should not be allowed to take that position, which
well, that's a really good example.
We read it on air, and I couldn't stop laughing.
Right. Well, that's a really good example of the chaos that ensues when you start to blow apart standard categories. There's a chaos in between categories that's made of an infinite multiplicity. That's why you see, too, with the LGBT rainbow, they're getting caught in their own metaphor. So there's an infinite number of gradations in a rainbow, and there's an infinite number of letters that are accumulating on the LGBT rainbow. And there's an element of clear absurdity to that. And one of them is, I believe it's Q+, that includes the other kin types. It's like... Well, the claim is, well, I'm marginalized, and then that sort of becomes normalized, and then there's a group right outside of that says, well, I'm marginalized too, and another group says, well, I'm also marginalized. And there's absolutely no logic. Once you've identified yourself as marginalized, there's no logical way that you can exclude anyone else who regards themselves as marginalized. And so the marginalized... The community of the marginalized expands and expands and expands and expands. And part of the reason for that is that every individual is a multiplicity. And there's an element to every individual that's marginalized. So for example,